A man in worn work clothes and a tool belt stood in the middle of a billion-dollar company's conference room. His hands were rough. His boots were dusty. And every single person in that room was laughing at him. But in less than 4 hours, that same man would bring one of the most powerful CEOs in the country to his knees. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with pure knowledge and quiet dignity. His name was Carlos Mendoza. He was 34 years old, a single father from East Los Angeles, and he was just there to fix the electrical wiring in a server room. Nobody asked for his opinion. Nobody wanted his help. And yet, what happened next would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. You see, Carlos had not always been an electrician. There was a time when he wore suits to work, sat in board meetings, and solved problems that made executives look good. But life had a different plan for him. And on that Tuesday morning in October, when he knocked on that conference room door with nothing but courage and a mind full of knowledge, the world finally saw who Carlos Mendoza really was. This is a story about pride, about pain, about a father who refused to let hard times define his worth. It is also a story about what happens when arrogance meets real talent. Stay with us, because this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. Welcome to Addictive Stories. 3 years before that October morning, Carlos Mendoza had a life that most people only dream about. At 31 years old, he was a senior software architect at a big technology company in Silicon Valley. He had graduated from a top university in California with a degree in computer science, and he had worked hard every single day to earn his place at the table. He lived in a clean, comfortable home in Fremont with his wife, Maria, and their daughter, Sophia, who was 8 years old and full of questions about everything. Maria was an elementary school teacher who loved her students like they were her own children. Every evening, the three of them would sit together for dinner, talk about their day, and laugh about small things. It was not a perfect life, but it was theirs, and it was good. Carlos was the kind of man who stayed late at work not because he had to, but because he loved solving difficult problems. His colleagues respected him. His managers trusted him. He was known for seeing patterns in systems that nobody else could see, for finding solutions that seemed impossible. He coached Sophia's soccer team on weekends. He helped his neighbors fix small things around their homes without asking for anything in return. He was, by every measure, a man who had built something solid and real. But as any person who has lived long enough knows, the things we build with our hands and our hearts can be taken away in a single moment. And for Carlos Mendoza, that moment was coming, dressed in the shape of a doctor's appointment that started with a simple headache. It started so small that Carlos almost did not notice. Maria began complaining about headaches during the spring of that year. She was tired after long days in the classroom. She said the new school curriculum was more demanding than before. She stayed up late grading papers, and her neck was always tense. Carlos would rub her shoulders at night and tell her to rest more. She would smile and say she was fine. But the headaches did not go away. They got worse. Some mornings, Maria could barely open her eyes against the light coming through the bedroom curtains. She started wearing sunglasses inside the house. She stopped eating as much. She became quieter in ways that worried Carlos deeply, but that she always explained away with a tired smile and the words, "I'm okay, mi amor, just tired." Finally, Carlos insisted she see a doctor. The first visit led to second. The second led to blood tests. The blood tests led to scans. And the scans led to a specialist who sat them both down in a small office and spoke words that Carlos would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. Maria had an aggressive brain aneurysm. It needed surgery immediately. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. Carlos held Maria's hand in the waiting room, while Sophia stayed with her grandmother, not fully understanding why everyone looked so serious. The surgery began, and then something went wrong. What was supposed to be a difficult but survivable procedure became a desperate fight to save Maria's life. She did not wake up from the operating table. She slipped into a coma that lasted for long months. Those 4 months were the slowest and most painful time Carlos had ever lived through. Every morning, he drove Sophia to school, kissed her on the forehead, and then drove straight to the hospital. He sat beside Maria's bed for hours, talking to her, reading to her, playing the songs she loved on his phone. The nurses knew him by name. They saved him coffee and asked about Sophia. He was grateful for every small kindness because small kindnesses were all he had. Sophia was only 8 years old, but children understand more than adults think. She knew something was very wrong with her mother. She stopped sleeping well. She cried in her room at night when she thought Carlos could not hear her. During the day, she held herself together with the same quiet strength her mother had always shown. Carlos tried to protect her from the worst of it, but he also knew he could not lie to her. He told her that Mama was very sick and that the doctors were doing everything they could. Sophia would nod and then ask if she could draw a picture to put beside Mama's bed. She drew a new picture every single week. 22 drawings of flowers, butterflies, and their little families standing together in the sun. On a quiet Tuesday morning in spring, with sunlight coming through the hospital window and a nurse softly closing the door behind her, Maria Mendoza passed away. She was 30 years old. Carlos sat beside her bed for a very long time. He did not cry right away. He just held her hand and looked at her face and tried to memorize every single detail. Grief does strange things at times. Some hours felt like days. Some weeks disappeared completely. Carlos moved through his life like a man walking underwater. Everything slower, heavier, muffled. He took bereavement leave from work and stayed home with Sophia. They ate cereal for dinner some nights. They watched cartoons on the couch with a blanket over both of them. They cried together when they needed to and sat in silence when words were not enough. After 6 weeks, Carlos went back to work. He needed routine. He needed something to hold on to. But the office had changed while he was gone, or perhaps the office had always been that way and he was only now seeing it clearly. His manager, a man named Robert Hastings, called him into his office on his first day back and spoke the words that hit Carlos like a second blow. The company had restructured during his absence. His position had been eliminated. There were no comparable roles available. Carlos sat very still in that chair and listened carefully, asking about his years of experience, about the projects he had led, about the team that depended on his guidance. Robert looked at the desk instead of at Carlos and said that all of it had been reassigned. He was sorry. He really was. Carlos drove home in silence. He sat in the car outside the apartment for a long time before going inside. Sophia was at school. The apartment was quiet. He was 31 years old, and in the space of a few months, he had lost his wife, his job, and the life they had built together. He had no idea how he was going to explain any of this to his daughter. The money ran out faster than Carlos had expected. Medical bills, funeral costs, and rent added up quickly. He applied for jobs in technology, sending out dozens of applications with a resume that showed years of solid experience and a degree from a respected university. The rejections came back politely but consistently. The job market had shifted. Companies wanted candidates who had been working continuously, not men who had taken leave to care for a dying wife. He began applying for anything he could find: warehouse work, delivery driving, construction labor. The transition from a climate-controlled office to physical work was hard on his body. His back hurt. His hands blistered. He came home exhausted in ways that were entirely new to him. He and Sophia moved out of their Fremont home and into a small studio apartment in East Oakland. The rent was $600 a month. Sophia's bedroom was a corner of the living room separated by a curtain Carlos hung from the ceiling with hooks he bought at the dollar store. "It is like camping," he told her, trying to make his voice sound like an adventure. She looked at him with 8-year-old eyes that understood too much and said, "Okay, Poppy." Carlos lay awake many nights on the couch that served as his bed and made himself a promise. He would not let Sophia grow up feeling ashamed of where they lived or who her father was. He did not know yet how he would keep that promise. But he made it anyway, quietly, to himself and to Maria's memory, on a night when the city outside was loud and the apartment was very small and the future looked completely uncertain. It was a job posting for an apprentice electrician that changed the direction of Carlos Mendoza's life. He had applied without much hope, expecting nothing. But the owner of the company, a man named Joe Martinez, did not care about resumes or university degrees. He cared about reliability. "Can you show up on time every day?" Joe asked during the interview, leaning back in his chair. "Can you do what I tell you and not complain? Carlos said yes to both. Joe hired him the same afternoon. The work was hard and the learning curve was steep, but Carlos discovered something unexpected. His background in technology made him unusually good at electrical work. Where other apprentices saw wires and circuits as mechanical problems, Carlos saw them as systems. He understood how each part communicated with every other part. He could trace a fault back to its source the way a good programmer traces a bug back to its origin. Joe noticed this within the first few weeks. "You think different," Joe told him one morning while they were working on a commercial building in downtown Oakland. "Most guys just follow the manual. You understand why the manual says what it says." Carlos worked hard. He earned his certification after 2 years of study and field work. He became known among clients as the electrician who solved the problems that other electricians gave up on. Slowly, very slowly, the weight on his shoulders began to feel a little lighter. Sophia started laughing again. She made friends at her new school. She drew pictures on the kitchen table while Carlos cooked dinner. And sometimes she sang to herself, and he stood at the stove and listened and felt something close to peace. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Joe Martinez called Carlos just after 7 in the morning. Carlos was at the kitchen table eating scrambled eggs with Sophia before her school drop-off, the same breakfast they had together every single weekday. Scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice. Joe's voice on the phone was serious but controlled. There was an emergency job at a large technology company in San Francisco. Their main server room was having serious electrical problems. Equipment was failing. The whole operation was at risk. Their regular contractor was not available. Could Carlos get there within the hour? "What kind of company?" Carlos asked. "Tech company." Joe said, "Cybersecurity and data. Big glass tower downtown. Premium rates for fast response." He paused. "Carlos, I need to warn you. These corporate types are not always easy. Just go in, fix the problem, and come back out. Don't get into conversations you don't need to have." Carlos understood what Joe meant. He had worked in enough expensive buildings to know how people in suits sometimes looked at men in work clothes and tool belts. He dropped Sophia off at school, kissed her on the forehead, and told her to have a good day. "You too, Poppy," she said, swinging her backpack up onto her shoulders. He watched her walk through the school doors and then drove his work van, a vehicle with faded lettering on the side that had seen better days, across the Bay Bridge towards San Francisco. He had no idea that by the end of that day, his life would never be the same again. The building where Meridian Industries was headquartered was the kind of place designed to make ordinary people feel small. Carlos had worked in buildings like this before, and he always felt the same quiet tension the moment he stepped through the front doors. The lobby had marble floors that reflected the overhead lights like a still pool of water. There was modern art on the walls that probably cost more than Carlos made in a year. A fountain ran down one entire side of the room, filling the space with the sound of moving water. The security guard at the front desk barely looked up when Carlos signed in. He handed over a visitor badge with the word service printed on it in plain letters and pointed toward the elevators without smiling. The ride up to the 35th floor was silent. Carlos stood in the elevator, surrounded by his own reflection in the polished steel walls, and breathed steadily. He was here to do a job, a specific, technical job that he was very good at. The rest of the building, the marble, the art, the cool way the security guard had looked through him, none of that mattered. What mattered was the server room. He found it quickly and understood within seconds why the company was in trouble. The electrical system was outdated and overwhelmed. Newer, more powerful servers have been added over time without upgrading the infrastructure that supported them. There were dangerous fluctuations running through the circuits. Equipment was failing because the power supply was unstable and unpredictable. Carlos set down his tool bag, pulled out his testing equipment, and got to work. This was the kind of problem he was made for. The server room shared a wall with the conference room, and the walls were thin. Carlos was focused on his work, tracing circuits, testing connections, identified a root of the electrical instability, when voices on the other side began to pull at his attention. At first it was just noise, stressed voices talking fast. But the words started to reach him clearly. A data breach, the entire system compromised, client information, financial records, and proprietary data all potentially exposed. A sophisticated cyber attack that had been ongoing for 6 hours and that the company's IT department could not stop or even fully understand. Carlos's hand slowed on his tools. The words triggered something deep in his memory. He had spent years building and analyzing systems just like the ones they were describing. He knew the language they were using. More than that, he began to recognize the shape of the problem they were describing. The way the attack seemed invisible to standard monitoring tools. The way it had gone undetected for so long before revealing itself. A voice in the room spoke with the authority of someone who ran everything and answered to no one. That voice was desperate beneath its hard surface, asking for solutions and getting none. Cybersecurity firms could not arrive until the next day. Consultants from New York could not come until Thursday. The stock price was already falling. Every minute of delay was costing the company millions. Carlos finished the last of his electrical connections, checked his work one final time, and began packing up his tools. He could have walked out. He should have walked out. That was the job. But he stood still for a long moment and thought about something he could not quite shake. Carlos stood outside the conference room door for almost a full minute before he knocked. In that minute, he had a complete argument with himself. This was not his problem. He was an electrician. These people had not asked for his help and would almost certainly not want it. Joe had told him to fix the problem and leave. He had a daughter at home. He did not need complications. But he also knew something. Not just suspected, knew. He had heard enough details through that wall to understand the shape of the attack they were dealing with. And he had seen this kind of vulnerability before, years ago, in a system he had helped build himself. If he was right, there was a way to not only stop the attack, but reverse it. He knocked. The room went silent. Chairs scraped. Whispers moved through the space. Then the door opened, and a man in an expensive suit with a loosened tie looked out at Carlos with the expression of someone who had been interrupted during the worst day of his life. Behind him, a room full of executives and IT professionals stared at the man in work clothes with a tool belt and the visitor badge that said service. Carlos took a breath. "I am sorry to interrupt," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I am the electrician who was working on your server room. I could not help but hear your conversation. I think I might be able to help with your cybersecurity problem." The man at the door stared at him. Then he turned slowly back to the room. "The electrician," he said, "thinks he can help with our cyber attack." And the room began to laugh. The laughter was not cruel in the way that a direct insult is cruel. It was the kind of laughter that comes from absurdity, from the gap between what a person looks like and what they are claiming to be. Carlos stood in the doorway and felt the sound land on him like something physical. He was wearing work clothes with a company logo on the chest. He had dust on his boots and a tool belt around his waist. And he was standing in a room full of people whose suits cost more than his monthly rent, telling them he could solve a problem that had defeated their entire team of professional experts. One person in the back of the room called out, "Did he try turning it off and back on again?" More laughter followed. Carlos kept his face still. He had learned, in the years since Maria died and the job disappeared and the savings ran out, how to keep his face still when something hurt. But before the laughter could fully settle, a new figure appeared at the door. He was tall and very well dressed, with the kind of posture that comes from never doubting your own importance. His eyes moved over Carlos the way a person examines something unexpected on the bottom of their shoe. "The electrician," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "And what exactly makes you think you understand cybersecurity, Mr. Mendoza?" Carlos said. "Carlos Mendoza. I have a background in computer science and systems architecture. I think I recognize the type of attack you're dealing with." The tall man's smile became something colder. "A background in computer science," he said. "From where exactly? Community college? Some online program?" The question was designed to embarrass. Carlos knew that. The tall man, whose name Carlos would learn in a moment, was Maxwell Thornton, CEO of Meridian Industries, was not looking for information. He was performing. He was showing a room who had power and who did not. Every person watching understood this. And Carlos understood it too. He felt the familiar weight of the past 3 years pressed down on him. The weight of losing Maria, of losing the job, of the studio apartment with a curtain dividing the living room, of all the moments when the world had looked at his circumstances and decided he had nothing worth hearing. He let the weight sit there for a second. Then he said quietly and without any drama, "MIT?" The room changed. Not dramatically, not immediately, but the quality of the silence shifted. The laughter that had been building died somewhere in people's throats. Maxwell Thornton's smile stayed on his face, but became something fixed rather than something alive. "MIT," he repeated slowly. "How impressive." He paused. "And yet, here you are, running electrical cables for a living. Quite an interesting career path, wouldn't you say?" Carlos kept his eyes on Thornton's face. "Life happens," he said simply. And in those 2 words, he packed 3 years of grief and struggle and getting back up every single morning and go to work and making dinner and helping with homework and refusing to disappear, all of it into 2 quiet words. The room was very still. Maxwell Thornton looked at him for a long moment, and then he made his offer. Maxwell Thornton was a man who used power the way other men use conversation, as a tool to establish who was in charge of every room he entered. What he said next was meant to be the final word, the move that would send Carlos back to his tool bag and end the interruption forever. "You know what?" Thornton said, turning slightly toward the room so that everyone could hear him clearly. "I am going to make you a deal." He paused. The room leaned in. "If you can actually solve this problem, if you can stop this attack and secure our systems, I will give you my company." The silence that followed was unlike the silence before. This was the silence of people who were not sure what they had just heard. Several executives exchanged looks. One of them started to speak, but stopped when Thornton held up one hand. "I am completely serious," Thornton continued, still looking at Carlos. "If an electrician from Morrison Electric can solve a problem that has stumped our entire IT team and multiple cybersecurity firms, then clearly I do not deserve to run this company." He smiled again, and this time the smile was all calculation. "And if you cannot solve it, which you will not, then you go back to your electrical work, and we never speak of this again. But you will have wasted time we cannot afford to lose." The offer was not real. Carlos understood that. It was a performance for the executives watching, a way to dismiss him while appearing generous and confident. But beneath all the theater, Carlos could see something else in Thornton's eyes. Something he recognized from the mirror from the nights after Maria died. Fear. Carlos looked around the conference room one more time before answering. He looked at the executives in their expensive suits, some amused, some nervous, a few just exhausted by the crisis they had been living inside for hours. He looked at the younger IT staff standing toward the back, the ones whose faces showed something different from amusement, something closer to hope. Then he thought about Sophia. She was probably in her after-school program right now, sitting at a small desk in a crowded room, working on math problems or drawing the margins of her notebook. He thought about their apartment, about the thin walls and the broken window latch he kept meaning to fix, about the way Sophia always checked the mail because she liked to be the one who brought inside. He thought about the problem itself, because that was the thing. Even in the middle of all the performance and arrogance in theater, the problem was real. And it was the kind of problem that Carlos Mendoza had been built to solve. "I will need complete access to your systems," he said. His voice was steady and carried clearly across the room. "Administrative access on all servers and network equipment. And I will need your IT team to follow my instructions without questioning them, even when they do not understand why." Maxwell Thornton's smile widened into something that looked satisfied and predatory at the same time. "Done," he said. "You have until market close. Roughly 4 hours." Carlos nodded once. He set his tool bag against the wall and walked toward the IT operations center. He did not look back. He had work to do. The IT operations center was a large room filled with rows of monitors showing real-time data, network traffic, system alerts, security warnings, all of it flashing and updating in a continuous stream of information. Red warning lights pulsed across multiple screens. The room had the charged, exhausted atmosphere of people who've been fighting a losing battle for many hours. The lead network administrator was a woman named Sarah Chun, 32 years old, with sharp eyes behind her glasses and controlled tension of someone who was very good at her job and very frustrated at not being good enough today. She looked at Carlos when he walked in with exactly the expression he had expected. Polite, professional, and deeply skeptical. "This is our real-time monitoring system," she said, gesturing at the screens. "As you can see, we are under an active attack across multiple vectors." Carlos studied the data. He did not speak immediately. He let his eyes move across the screens the way he had learned to move his eyes across electrical diagrams, looking not just at the individual data points, but at the shape they made together, at the relationships between them. "The main attack started at 2:47 in the morning," he said, pointing to a specific timestamp on one of the monitors. "But look here, 3 hours earlier. Do you see this anomalous traffic pattern?" Sarah leaned forward. Her expression shifted from skeptical to curious. "We missed that," she said quietly. "We were focused on the primary attack signature. Because you were looking for software-based intrusions," Carlos said, pulling a chair to the keyboard. "But this attack is working through the physical layer." Within the first 20 minutes, Carlos had confirmed what he had suspected from the moment he overheard the conversation through the wall. The attack was not the kind that standard security software was designed to find. It was operating below the software layer, in the hardware itself, specifically in the firmware of the network switches that managed traffic across Meridian's entire system. Someone had modified the firmware in those switches, almost certainly through a physical access point or a supply chain vulnerability, so that every authentication request passing to the network was being silently copied and redirected. Every time someone logged into any part of Meridian's system, the compromised hardware created a shadow session that gave the attackers identical access in real time. The company's software-based detection tools could not see this because the attack was not happening at the level they were monitoring. It was like trying to catch a thief by watching the door when the thief was already inside the walls of the building. "That is brilliant," said Marcus, a young security analyst standing close behind Carlos, his voice low and awed, "and completely invisible to everything we have running. How did you identify this so quickly?" Sarah asked. "Because I've been crawling through buildings and tracing electrical circuits for 3 years," Carlos replied. "Still working. You learn to see the connections that other people walk past." The IT team gathered around his workstation in a loose half-circle. Nobody was laughing now. Nobody was looking at Carlos's work clothes or tool belt. They were watching his hands move across the keyboard and listening to his explanations with the full attention of professionals who recognized expertise when they saw it. Stopping the intrusion was only the first part of what Carlos planned to do. He worked through it methodically, identifying every compromised switch, documenting the modified firmware signatures, and beginning the process of isolating and neutralizing each point of vulnerability while keeping the attackers unaware that their access was being systematically removed. But as he worked, he was also doing something else. He was following the attack back to its source. The compromised switches had maintained a persistent connection to the attacker's command and control servers, a live channel through which stolen data was being transmitted. That channel, Carlos explained to the IT team gathered around him, worked in both directions. "What I'm going to do now is essentially hijack their hijack," he said, his voice calm and focused. "They built a back door to get into your system. That same back door is how I'm going to get into theirs." The main display screen showed network traffic patterns, shifting as Carlos redirected the data flow. Instead of information leaving Meridian's servers, the connection was now being used to map the attacker's own infrastructure. Sarah stood beside him, watching the screen with wide eyes. "You are tracing them in real time," she said. "More than tracing," Carlos replied. "I am inside their command and control server. They left themselves vulnerable by maintaining an active connection. They thought they were invisible. They were not." He highlighted a directory on a secondary monitor. "Your stolen data," he said. "All of it, still sitting on their servers because they have not had time to process and distribute it yet." Word had spread through the building. One by one, then in small groups, executives and managers began appearing at the door of the operations center, drawn by whispered reports of what was happening inside. Maxwell Thornton himself had been standing in the back of the room for nearly an hour, his arms crossed, his expression impossible to read. He had come in expecting to watch a brief and embarrassing failure. Instead, he was watching something he did not fully understand but could not look away from. The IT team that had been defeated and demoralized for 6 hours was now moving with focus and energy, following Carlos's instructions without hesitation. Sarah Chun, who had introduced herself to Carlos with barely concealed doubt, was now anticipating his next request before he made it. Pulling up system files and logs a moment, she saw where his analysis was heading. Marcus, the young analyst who had called the attack brilliant, was implementing the countermeasures Carlos specified with fast, confident keystrokes. For nearly 2 hours, the operations center became the kind of place that happens when the right people finally have the right direction. Conversations were short and technical. Nobody wasted words. The monitors that had been flashing red for hours began to show different colors. Green indicators spread slowly across the network map as compromised systems were isolated, cleaned, and restored. Stolen data flowed back into Meridian servers from the attacker's infrastructure. Client records, financial data, proprietary algorithms, all of it coming home. With 30 minutes left before market close, Carlos announced the final phase. Now, he said, we end this completely. The final phase took 23 minutes. Carlos worked with the concentrated precision of someone who had spent years learning to be thorough. An electrician never leaves a job half-finished, because a half-finished electrical job can burn a building down. The same principle applied here. He had identified the criminal organization's full infrastructure, server locations, attack tools, the identities of the people behind the operation, and evidence of at least 12 other major attacks they had conducted against companies across the country and abroad. He documented everything carefully, preserving the evidence in secure copies that could be handed over to federal authorities. Then he planted logic bombs throughout the attacker's network, hidden programs designed to trigger simultaneously on his command, wiping every hard drive, destroying every backup, corrupting every piece of data the organization had accumulated over years of criminal operation. "Watch this," he said quietly. He pressed a single key. On the main screen, the attacker's servers began going offline one by one, not just disconnecting, disappearing completely. Years of stolen data, criminal tools, and operational records, all of it gone in under 3 minutes. The operations center erupted. IT staff who had arrived that morning to face the worst professional crisis of their careers were now on their feet, clapping and shouting. Even the executives in the back of the room were applauding. The Meridian stock price, visible on a side monitor someone had pulled up, was already beginning to recover as news spread through financial markets that the breach had been contained. With 7 minutes left before market close, Carlos leaned back in his chair and looked at the screen. The systems were clean. The attack was over. His work was done. The room was still vibrating with relief and celebration when Maxwell Thornton moved through the crowd toward the front of the operations center. The people around him made way without being asked. He stopped a few feet from where Carlos sat and looked at the screens for a long moment without speaking. The monitors showed a system that was more secure now than it had been before the attack began. The stock price had stabilized. The criminal organization that had targeted Meridian was gone. The evidence needed for federal prosecution was packaged and ready. Everything Thornton had asked for, everything he had said was impossible, had been delivered with 7 minutes to spare by a man he had publicly mocked in front of his entire executive team. Thornton turned to look at the room. The faces looking back at him told him everything he needed to know about what they thought of this moment. He had made a public bet in front of witnesses. He had said the words clearly, "If you solve this, I will give you my company." He had never expected to have to follow through. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Mendoza," he said. His voice was quiet in a way that it had not been quiet before. The arrogance was gone, or at least it was hidden beneath something heavier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice slightly so the room could hear him clearly, "I believe I owe Mr. Mendoza my company." The silence that followed was total. Not a chair moved. Not a phone buzzed. Everyone in that room was waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next was the last thing any of them expected. Carlos looked at Maxwell Thornton for a moment. Then he smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was not the smile of a man who had been waiting to see someone powerful brought low. It was something gentler than that. Something that surprised everyone watching. "Mr. Thornton," Carlos said, "I do not want your company." The words landed in the silence like a stone into still water. Thornton blinked. He genuinely did not understand what he had heard. I do not want your company, Carlos repeated, his voice calm and clear. What I want is something that cannot be bought or transferred through a legal document. He paused, letting the moment settle. I want respect, not for myself alone, though that would be a start, but for every person who has ever walked into a building like this one with a tool bag and been made to feel invisible. I want you to remember, the next time someone's job title makes you think their opinion does not matter, that you almost lost everything today, and the person who saved you was wearing work clothes. He began packing his tools back into his bag. The room watched him in complete silence. I want Sarah Chun to be your new Chief Information Security Officer. She understood everything I was doing faster than anyone else here. She is the reason your team held together today. He zipped the bag closed. And I want Marcus to receive a promotion. He has the kind of mind that will protect this company for years if you let it. Carlos stood and lifted his tool bag onto his shoulder. He was not finished. Carlos stood with his tool bag on his shoulder and looked at Maxwell Thornton one final time. The CEO of a billion-dollar company stood very still, listening in a way that he probably had not listened to anyone for a very long time. One more thing, Carlos said. Morrison Electric deserves your company's electrical maintenance contract. Joe Martinez runs an honest business and treats every person who works for him with dignity. You should try working with people like that. It makes everything better. He turned toward the door. The crowd parted to let him through without anyone needing to ask. He walked past executives who had laughed at him 2 hours ago. He walked past IT staff who were watching him with something close to reverence. He walked past Marcus, who nodded at him with an expression of quiet gratitude that Carlos would not forget for a long time. He was almost at the elevator when Thornton's voice came from behind him. Wait, please. Carlos stopped. He turned around slowly. Thornton was standing in the middle of the room, and for the first time since Carlos had knocked on that conference room door, the CEO looked like a man without a script. I was wrong, Thornton said. About everything. About you. About the way I spoke to you. He paused, searching for words that were clearly unfamiliar to him. You could name your price to work here. Chief Security Officer. Chief Technology Officer. Whatever you want. Carlos looked at him for a long moment. Then he said the truest thing he had said all day. What I want is to go home to my daughter and help her with her homework. Maybe order pizza for dinner, because her father had a very good day at work. And he stepped into the elevator. The elevator doors closed, and Carlos was alone with his reflection again, the same polished steel walls he had ridden up in that morning. But the man looking back at him now was different from the man who had ridden up, not in appearance. He was still wearing the same work clothes, still carrying the same worn tool bag, still had dust on his boots and the faint smell of electrical work about him. But something in his posture had changed, something in his face. He thought about Maria on that ride down. He did this sometimes. Had quiet conversations with her in his head during moments she would have wanted to know about. He told her about the server room and the conference room door and the laughter and Maxwell Thornton's cold blue eyes. He told her about the 4 hours of work, about Sarah and Marcus and the moment the screens went green. He told her about the smile on Thornton's face when he made his offer and about the different look on Thornton's face when Carlos said no. He thought she would have liked that part. She had always believed that the right response to arrogance was not anger, but something quieter and more durable. He thought about Sophia waiting in her after-school program, probably wondering if she would get pizza for dinner. He had promised nothing. But he knew already that they were going to have pizza. He had earned it. They had both earned it, in all the ways that mattered. The small daily ways of getting through hard years without losing what made them who they were. Carlos picked Sophia up from her after-school program at 5:30 in the afternoon. She came running out through the double doors with her backpack, bouncing, and her hair coming loose from its braid the way it always did by the end of the day. She launched herself at him, and he caught her and held her for a second longer than usual. "Pizza?" she said into his shoulder, because she could already tell from the way he was holding her that something good had happened. "Pizza," he confirmed. They went to the place 3 blocks from their apartment, the one with the red and white tablecloths, and the owner, who always gave Sophia extra cheese on her slice, without being asked. Carlos told her about his day in the version that a 9-year-old needed to hear. He told her that he had gone to fix some electrical problems at a very big company, and that while he was there, he had been able to help them with another problem, a computer problem that nobody else had been able to solve. He told her that a man had been rude to him because of the way he looked, but that Carlos had kept his head and done his work, and in the end, the man had learned something. Were you scared? Sophia asked, pulling apart her slice with careful fingers. A little, Carlos admitted, but I knew what I was doing, and that helped. She thought about this for a moment. Mama always said you were the smartest person she ever met, Sophia said, not looking up from her pizza. Carlos was quiet for a long time after that. Your mama was very generous, he finally said. Sophia looked up and smiled. She was right, though. The weeks after that October Tuesday moved differently for everyone who had been in that operations center. Sarah Chun was offered the position of Chief Information Security Officer by the end of the week. She accepted on the condition that she could restructure the entire security team from the ground up, and Thornton agreed without negotiating. Under her leadership, Meridian implemented a new security framework that became a model for other companies in the industry. Marcus received his promotion and was given leadership of a new threat analysis division. He told everyone who asked that the most important thing he had learned that day was to look for vulnerabilities at the physical layer, not just the software level. A lesson that, in the following 4 months, helped his team prevent 3 major attacks before they could do any damage. Morrison Electric received the maintenance contract for all of Meridian facilities. Joe Martinez called Carlos the morning the contract arrived and said nothing for a few seconds. Then he said, I don't know what you did over there, but whatever was, thank you. Carlos laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and surprised. And in the halls of Meridian Industries, something else began to change. Not overnight and not perfectly, but genuinely. Thornton had been shaken in a way that went beyond the professional. He began asking questions he had never thought to ask before about who was in the building every day, about what the maintenance staff knew, about what the people without titles understood that the people with titles had missed. 6 months after that October Tuesday, a letter arrived on a Saturday morning while Carlos and Sophia were having breakfast at their kitchen table. Pancakes, the same ones Maria used to make from a recipe on a card that Sophia kept in a small box in her room. The envelope was from Meridian Industries, but the handwriting on the outside was personal, not a business hand, but the careful writing of someone who put effort into the act of addressing it. Carlos opened it slowly. The letter was from Maxwell Thornton. It was not the kind of letter his lawyers would have approved. It had no formal greeting, no corporate language, no carefully constructed distance. It was a letter from a man who had spent 6 months thinking about a single day and what that day had taught him. Thornton wrote about Sarah Chen's work and Marcus's new division. He wrote about the Morrison Electric contract and what Joe Martinez's team had done for the building. He wrote about the new policies Meridian had put in place. Policies that evaluated employees and contractors based on their actual contributions rather than their credentials and titles. He wrote that it was remarkable how much better ideas became when the people who had them felt that they were genuinely heard. And then he wrote something that Carlos read twice before folding the letter carefully back into its envelope. He wrote that he still thought about that day often, about how wrong he had been, about how gracefully Carlos had handled something that he, Thornton, had not deserved to have handled gracefully, and that the offer still stood whenever and if ever Carlos wanted it. The apartment they lived in now was in a nicer part of Vallejo, not expensive, not grand, but clean and quiet with a small yard where Sophia had asked to plant tomatoes and Carlos had said yes. The broken window latch had been fixed. The couch was still his bed, but it was a better couch. There were books on a shelf by the door and drawings on the refrigerator, and a photograph of Maria on the small table near the window where the afternoon light fell on it in a way that Carlos had arranged very specifically and deliberately. He had received several consulting fees from companies that had heard about what happened at Meridian and reached out through quiet channels for help improving their own security infrastructure. He charged fair rates and did thorough work and turned down any offer that felt like it was trying to buy something that was not for sale. He had been promoted to lead technician at Morrison Electric and was now training 2 new apprentices. One of them a 22-year-old from Stockton named Danny, who reminded Carlos of himself at that age, and the other a woman named Rosa, who had been working in construction for 4 years and had the same kind of pattern recognition instinct that Joe Martinez had always valued over credentials. Carlos mentored them both with patience and specificity. He told them what Joe had told him. Show up every day, do the job right, and see the connections that other people walk past. He told them the rest of it too. The parts about dignity and character, and what happens when you knock on the right door at the right time and refuse to walk away. On a Saturday afternoon in April, Carlos and Sophia walked to the park near their apartment the way they did most weekends when the weather was good. The Bay Area spring had arrived with warm light, and the smell of cut grass, and the sound of families spread out across the open lawns with picnic blankets and soccer balls and dogs. Sophia was holding Carlos's hand and swinging it slightly as they walked, the way she had done since she was small enough for him to carry. She asked him the question she had been working up to for several weeks. He could tell, because Sophia always went quiet in a particular way before asking something important. "Poppy," she said, "do you ever miss your old job?" "The computer work." Carlos considered the question carefully. He did not rush his answer, because the question deserved a real one. "I miss parts of it," he said. "I miss the way a very difficult problem feels when you finally understand it. I miss working with systems that nobody else could read." He paused. "But I do not miss the way that world sometimes makes people forget what actually matters." "What actually matters?" Sophia asked. He thought about Maria. He thought about Joe Martinez and Sarah Chun and Marcus, and the 2 apprentices at Morrison Electric. He thought about the look on Thornton's face when Carlos had said, "I do not want your company." "Taking care of the people we love," Carlos said. "Treating everyone with respect, no matter what they do. Being proud of honest work, in whatever form it takes." Sophia nodded slowly, the way she nodded when something made complete sense to her. "I am proud of you, Poppy," she said. He squeezed her hand. "I am proud of you too, Mija. There are stories about success that measured in money, in titles, in the size of an office or the price of a car. Carlos Mendoza's story is not that kind of story. What Carlos won that day at Meridian Industries could not be transferred in a legal document or announced in a press release. He won back something that 3 years of grief and struggle and being looked past had slowly worn down, the unshakable knowledge of his own worth, not arrogance, not the brittle kind of pride that needs other people's admiration to survive, something quieter and stronger, the kind of knowing that comes from doing hard things honestly for a long time and refusing to pretend they are not hard. He won it back not by humiliating Maxwell Thornton, who had handed him every opportunity to do exactly that. He won it back by doing what he had always done, seeing the problem clearly, solving it thoroughly, and then asking only for what was genuinely fair. That combination, clear sight, thorough work, fair asking, is harder than it sounds. It requires a person know who they are when the room is laughing at them. It requires a person to have something inside that cannot be taken away by circumstances, by loss, by the condescending voice of someone who has decided that work clothes mean a person has nothing valuable to say. Carlos had that thing inside him. Maria had helped him build it. 3 years of getting back up every morning had tested it and confirmed it. And on a Tuesday in October, in a glass tower in San Francisco, the world had finally had the chance to see it for what it was. This is the kind of story we love sharing here on Addictive Stories. And today, it ends well. On the last Saturday of April, while Sophia was in the yard checking on her tomato plants, and Carlos was sitting on the back step with a cup of coffee, and the letter from Maxwell Thornton folded in his shirt pocket, he thought about what he would say if someone asked him what the lesson of his story was. Not the lesson for Thornton. That one was obvious, and Thornton had learned it himself, slowly and genuinely, in the 6 months since October. The lesson for everyone else. For the person watching this who has been in a room where people laughed at them. For the person who has lost something. A job, a partner, a version of the future they plan on, and is trying to figure out how to move forward without losing themselves in the process. He thought he would say this. Your circumstances are not your character. What you are going through right now is not who you are. The two things can look very similar from the outside, and there will always be people willing to confuse them for their own convenience. Do not let them make you believe it too. Do the work that is in front of you. Do it with everything you have, not because someone is watching, but because doing it thoroughly is who you are. Take care of the people who depend on you. Not perfectly, not heroically, but consistently and with your whole heart. And when the moment comes, and it will come, when you know something that the room does not know and the room is laughing at you anyway, remember Carlos Mendoza. Take a breath. Knock on the door. Sophia ran in from the yard holding a small green tomato, her face completely lit up. Poppy, look. He set down his coffee and went to see.